Let me tell you something about the moment your entire understanding of physical reality collapses. It doesn't feel like falling. It doesn't feel like sleeping. It feels like someone has taken the document of your life, fed it through a shredder, and then, with no warning, no consent, no severance package, handed you back a completely different brief. My name is Shen Mu. was a corporate litigation attorney, senior associate at Liang Fang & Associates. 6 years of law school, 4 years building a reputation sharp enough to cut through reinforced steel. I had a coffee machine that cost more than most people's rent. I had a 12-step skincare routine. I had a standing desk. And then I had none of those things, because I woke up here. The first thing I noticed was the cold. Not the polite air-conditioned cold of a modern office building. I mean bone-deep cold, the kind that seeps through silk like it has a personal vendetta. And there was so much silk. Silk on the floor, silk on the walls, silk draped from the ceiling in curtains the color of faded bruises, deep violet, old gold, the kind of colors that exist only in paintings, in nightmares. The second thing I noticed was the smell. Sandalwood. Burning, something floral and oversweet that coated the back of my throat like an obligation I hadn't agreed to. The third thing I noticed was the body. My body, which was not, emphatically, definitively, with extreme legal prejudice, my body. I will not dwell on this part at length because I have made my peace with it, professionally speaking. What I will say is this. The hands I held up in front of my face were slender and pale in a way that suggested a lifetime of careful, deliberate inactivity. The wrists had the circumference of someone who had never once carried their own groceries. There were rings, jade, I think, and something dark like onyx, on fingers that trembled as I turned them over in the pale morning light filtering through latticed windows. Outside those windows, a courtyard I did not recognize. Plum trees, a stone path, 2 guards standing at attention so rigid they looked like they'd been carved there, permanent features of the architecture, utterly uninterested in me. I sat up slowly. Big mistake. Every muscle in this borrowed body screamed in protest, a dull systemic ache, the kind that comes not from exertion, but from prolonged, I would later understand, neglect. This body had not been well cared for. This body had been existing in a state of careful, sustained misery for what felt in the muscle memory like quite a long time. I made myself breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Litigation breathing, courtroom breathing, the kind of deliberate respiratory exercise that reminds your nervous system that you are a professional, and panic, while understandable, is inadmissible. On the low lacquered table beside the sleeping mat, and I noticed for the record that the sleeping mat was pristine, as though it had not been slept on in some time, as though the person who lived here perhaps had been sleeping elsewhere, or not at all. On that table, there was a scroll. Cream-colored paper, red ink, an enormous seal pressed at the bottom like a formal signature, except instead of a signature, it was the kind of symbol that communicated, even to someone with no context, that it came from somewhere very high up. I picked it up. I unrolled it, and as I read, in a language I had no business understanding, but somehow understood perfectly, because Transmigration apparently comes with a complimentary translation package, I felt the very specific, very precise sensation I associate with reading a particularly hostile contract for the first time. The sensation that says, someone has tried to bury you in language, and they almost succeeded. The imperial decree of banishment, issued in the 43rd year of the Tianlong reign, pertaining to the male consort of the 3rd rank, Wei Ziyan of the Jianxi Pavilion, by order of His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Zhao Liangchen. And it said, in language that was florid and elaborate and dripping with classical illusion, which reduced, legally, to this. You are to be removed from the imperial register. You are stripped of your rank, your stipend, your household staff, and your imperial protection. You are to remain in the Jianxi Pavilion until such time as a formal exile order is issued. You may not petition the throne. You may not send correspondence outside the palace walls. You may not... I put the scroll down. I put it down very carefully, which took considerable effort, because what I wanted to do was throw it across the room. Because what this document was, underneath the imperial seals and the red ink and the formal invocation of heaven's authority, was a termination notice, and a particularly sloppy one. I picked it back up. I read it again, slower this time. The way I read contracts when I suspect the other party has been clever but not quite clever enough. There. Third paragraph, second clause. This decree is issued under the authority of the Rights Codex, Volume 7, pertaining to matters of the Inner Palace. The Rights Codex. I didn't know what that was. I had no reason to know what that was. I had woken up in a 9th century imperial palace approximately 40 minutes ago, and my primary qualification was an understanding of modern corporate law. But I knew something, because the body I was inhabiting, Wei Ziyan, a discarded male consort apparently, had a memory. Not sharp, not fully accessible, like a hard drive I'd been handed without the password, but impressionistic, emotional, soaked in quiet, sustained humiliation and a strange, persistent intelligence that had gone largely unused. And somewhere in that impressionistic memory, there was a shape, the shape of old laws, dusty precedents, the kind of obscure imperial codex that nobody cited anymore because nobody needed to, because the situations it covered were considered thoroughly obsolete. I rolled the decree back up very carefully. I set it on the table, and I said out loud to the empty silk-draped room, because I needed to hear it in a real human voice, even if that voice was currently operating out of a body I had not auditioned for. All right, Shenmue, you passed the bar on your first attempt. You argued in front of the Commercial Disputes Tribunal at 28. You once made a corporate CFO cry in a deposition. You can work with this.
The corrupt official's name was Zhao Pengli, eunuch administrator of the Inner Palace. He arrived at the Qianxi Pavilion 3 days after I woke up, with the energy of someone who had spent their career growing very comfortable with power they didn't technically possess. He was accompanied by 4 attendants and a document, another one, this one ordering the formal inventory of my quarters, which was, as any competent legal mind would immediately recognize, the procedural step that precedes confiscation. He smiled at me, the kind of smile that announces, without subtlety, that the power differential in this room is being thoroughly enjoyed. I smiled back. I had spent 3 days in preparation. 3 days of reading everything in the Qianxi Pavilion that could be read, the administrative ledgers, the household accounts, the correspondence logs that had been left carelessly behind by the previous staff, who had, I noted, been systematically reassigned over the past year, leaving Wei Ziyan almost entirely isolated. 3 days of accessing Wei Ziyan's fragmented memory with the patience of a forensic accountant going through shredded files. 3 days of finding the loophole. Administrator Zhao began his speech. It was, I will give him this, an impressively structured address. He had clearly given it before. It moved from formal greeting to false sympathy to administrative necessity with the smooth efficiency of a workflow someone had perfected over many repetitions. He expressed, with tremendous insincerity, his regret that the matter of Lord Wei's dismissal from the Imperial Register had created such inconvenience. I let him finish. Then I said very quietly, in the voice of someone who has reviewed the relevant documentation and confident in their position, Administrator Zhao, before you continue, I'd like to cite the supplementary provisions of the Rights Codex, Volume 12, Section 4. The section pertaining to the rights of petition for individuals of former imperial rank. He stopped smiling. Good. I hadn't been entirely sure Volume 12 existed. I'd pieced it together from 3 separate references in Wei Ziyan's fragmented memory, cross-referenced against the administrative ledgers, like reconstructing a statute from citations alone. But the look on Zhao Pengli's face told me I'd gotten it right. Section 4, I continued, because momentum in legal argument is everything, establishes that an individual who has held third-rank status in the Inner Palace and has been issued a banishment decree retains for a period of 30 days following the decree's issuance the right to submit a formal petition directly to the throne. This petition cannot be intercepted, denied, or administratively delayed by any officer of rank below the Imperial Court of Senior Advisors. I tilted my head. Your rank, Administrator, is Senior Eunuch of the 4th Administrative Division, unless I'm mistaken about the palace hierarchy, and I have been reviewing the ledgers quite carefully. That falls below the threshold specified in Section 4. Silence. The 4 attendants were staring at me with the particular expression of people who had expected this to be a routine visit and are now recalibrating dramatically. Administrator Zhao said very carefully, Lord Wei has never before shown interest in the Codex. I smiled. It was Wei Ziyan's face doing the smiling, but the architecture behind it was entirely Shenmue.
Lord Wei, I said, has had some time to think. I submitted the petition that afternoon through a channel that Zhao Pengli could not technically block without violating the exact provision I had cited. I know because I watched him try to find a way to block it. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the search for a counter-provision, a higher authority, a procedural workaround, and I watched him come up empty.
The petition reached the throne in 2 days, and on the 3rd day, the emperor came to the Qianqi Pavilion. I need you to understand something about the physical reality of an emperor arriving at your quarters. It is not, in any meaningful sense, like anything in the modern world. There is no adequate frame of reference. The closest I can construct is imagine you have been living alone in a very quiet house, and then the house itself becomes aware of you. Not a person entering the building, the space. Everything in the immediate environment reorganizes around a single point. I heard them before I saw them, the outer courtyard going silent, not the silence of emptiness, the compressed silence of many people choosing absolute stillness simultaneously. Then the sound of boots on stone, a rhythm too measured to be anything other than deliberate. Then the guards at my door, the 2 carved stone ones going from rigid to something that transcended rigidity, some posture beyond posture. Then the door opened, and I understood for the first time, viscerally and without any ambiguity, why the phrase commanding presence exists in every language on earth. Emperor Zhao Liangchen was, I will be professionally accurate about this, not what I had constructed in my mind. My mental image of an emperor had been assembled from drama productions and textbook illustrations, formal, ornate, probably older, probably softened by power and comfort. Zhao Liangchen was none of those things. He was perhaps 30, perhaps slightly less, tall in a way that seemed to alter the dimensions of the room. His robes were dark, deep blue-black, almost no ornamentation, which I would later understand was its own kind of statement, the deliberate restraint of someone who requires no decoration to communicate authority. His face was, and I am being a factual witness here, not editorializing, extraordinary. The kind of face that seems to have been constructed with structural integrity as the primary criterion. Strong lines, eyes that were very dark and very still, and which moved across the space with the unhurried precision of someone cataloging. Those eyes landed on me. I stood up. Not because I was intimidated, I was absolutely intimidated, let the record reflect, but because standing up is what you do in a courtroom when something significant is about to happen, and every instinct I had was telling me this was, in every meaningful sense, a courtroom. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was, there is no diplomatic way to say this, distractingly low and precise, like each word had been selected by a committee and approved before deployment. You cited the supplementary provisions. Not a question, an observation with the weight of a judgment behind it. I did, Your Majesty, I said. No one has cited the supplementary provisions in my reign, possibly in my father's reign either. The provisions are valid regardless of frequency citation, Your Majesty. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, and this is the detail I have returned to many times because it was entirely unexpected, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, the ghost of a smile. The suggestion that somewhere in the architecture of that remarkable face there was a capacity for amusement that was very rarely deployed. Tell me, he said, what it is you actually want. And this is where I made the choice that changed everything. Because the correct answer, the expected answer, the answer Wei Ziyan's body seemed to lean toward instinctively, pulling me like muscle memory, was something supplicating, something about mercy, something that positioned me as a petitioner seeking restoration of favor, which would have been both truthful and tactically catastrophic because it would have cast me back into the role of a discarded consort, hoping to be recollected. Instead, I said, Your Majesty, I want to discuss the imperial tax reallocation decree of the 39th year. The stillness in the room became a different kind of stillness. The tax decree, Zhao Liangchen said. Specifically, I continued, and I had rehearsed this, I want to be clear, I had rehearsed it 12 times minimum in the 3 days prior. The reallocation formula in Appendix C, which redistributes river toll revenue from the northern provinces to the central treasury. The formula contains what I believe to be a structural error, not an intentional one. I am not suggesting fraud, but an arithmetic oversight in the compounding calculation that has, over the 4 years since the decree's implementation, resulted in the northern satraps receiving approximately 30% less than the formula's stated intention. I watched his face. Nothing moved. Absolutely nothing. The man had the poker face of someone who has practiced concealment as a survival skill since early childhood, which, given that he was an emperor, was probably accurate. But his eyes shifted just slightly, a fractional recalibration. "You have calculated this," he said. "I have, Your Majesty. I can demonstrate the calculation if you have access to the relevant revenue ledgers, which I suspect you do given that you are the emperor." Another pause. Then he said, very quietly, "The northern satraps have been sending complaints to the Court of Revenue for 3 years. "I know," I said. "I read the administrative correspondence that was left in the pavilion. The complaints have been consistently dismissed as," I glanced at my mental notes, "an expression of provincial self-interest inconsistent with imperial accounting standards, which is an administratively convenient response, but not a mathematically accurate one." Chao Liang-chen looked at me for what felt like a very long time. Then he said to the attendants behind him, "Leave us." And we talked for 4 hours. I want to be precise about what happened in those 4 hours, because it has a bearing on everything that came after, and I am constitutionally incapable of imprecision in matters of consequence. He did not ask about Wei Xian. He did not address the banishment decree, the petition, the administrative drama that had precipitated this meeting. It was as if, and this is a very particular kind of intellect, I recognized it immediately because I have occasionally encountered it in senior partners and opposing counsel, as if he had assessed the situation in the first 60 seconds and determined that those elements were now irrelevant, that something more interesting was available, and he had pivoted without announcement or apology. He asked about the tax calculation. I showed him. We sat at the low table, him cross-legged on the opposite side, which I found startling. The emperor of this whole extraordinary empire simply sitting across from me without ceremony, and I drew the compounding formula in the margin of the petition I'd submitted, talking him through the arithmetic error with the attention to detail I'd apply to a financial fraud case. He followed it, not politely actually. He asked questions at the precise points where I would ask questions. He identified the secondary implications before I named them. When I reached the conclusion about the 3-year revenue shortfall, he sat back and said, with the tone of someone filing information away, "My Court of Revenue has 15 senior advisors with direct responsibility for this decree." "Yes," I said. "None of them identified this error." "No." A pause.
"You have been in this pavilion," he said, "with no formal mathematical training documented in your household record, in enforced isolation, with access to administrative correspondence that should not have been left in your possession." "That would be an accurate summary," I agreed. "And you found this in 3 days. 2.5, actually. The 3rd day I was refining the calculation and preparing for this conversation. And there it was again, that fractional, almost invisible shift at the corner of his mouth. 'Who are you?' he asked, and I thought, that is the most dangerous question I have ever been asked, and I have been asked some extremely dangerous questions. I said, 'I am Lord Wei Xian, 3rd rank consort, recently banished, currently petitioning for the opportunity to be useful.' He looked at me for a long moment. 'Useful,' he repeated. The word seemed to interest him. 'It is a more sustainable basis for a relationship than beauty, which, as we have established, has a limited shelf life in these corridors.' And this time it was unmistakable. It was brief and quickly contained, but it was real. He smiled. He left the Qianxi pavilion as the sun was setting. He did not address the banishment. He did not formally rescind it or confirm it. He simply stood and gave me a look that I had learned in my years of practice to categorize precisely. It was the look of someone who has decided they are coming back. He came back the following night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Let me tell you what these consultations were, because there is a version of this story, the version that the ladies of the neighboring pavilions were absolutely telling each other, I am under no illusions, where these nightly visits mean something quite different, something more traditional to the palace narrative. They were not that. They were, in the truest and most disorienting sense, the most intellectually intense experience of my life, including law school, including the Baolin Financial Group fraud case, which had previously held the record. Zhao Liangchen arrived each night between the second and third evening watch, always without formal announcement, or rather with the palace equivalent of without announcement, which means he sent exactly one attendant ahead instead of the full ceremonial train, which I was told later was a significant departure from protocol, and had sent the senior chamberlains into quiet, dignified panic. He arrived, he sat, he brought scrolls, his scrolls, ongoing policy disputes, administrative grievances from the outer provinces, draft legislation that his senior advisers had prepared, and which he regarded, I gathered, with the same mixture of respect and deep personal suspicion that I have for any document I haven't written myself. He'd lay them out on the table between us, a low lacquered table that was objectively not large enough for two people to work at simultaneously without some significant renegotiation of personal space, and he would say, in that precise, unhurried voice, "Tell me what you see," and I would tell him. Because here is what I discovered in those long evenings over ink and lamplight. The principles of legal analysis are not error-specific. A contract is a contract, whether it's printed on A4 paper in a glass-walled office or brushed in classical script on cream-colored imperial parchment. The anatomy of an argument, premise, evidence, implication, and conclusion does not change with the century. The tactics of institutional self-interest, the structural patterns of corruption, the way power embeds itself in administrative language and hides behind procedural complexity, eternal.
Completely eternal. I told him during the consultation on the third night about a principle I had used in a property dispute 3 years prior, the concept of nested obligations, where a primary agreement generates secondary duties that can override the primary agreement's stated terms under specific conditions. I translated it into the framework of his feudal land tenure system as I spoke, watching his face. He was listening the way extraordinarily intelligent people listen when they are encountering something genuinely new, completely still, eyes focused at a point slightly above my shoulder, which is where very internally active thinkers look when they're processing something in real time. Then he said, "That principle, if applied to the river garrison treaties." And he stopped, and I saw it, the moment he saw it. I knew that moment. I had had that moment myself in a seminar room at law school, when I understood for the first time how a single conceptual framework could reorganize a dozen separate problems into one solvable system, the moment when the map of something clarifies. His eyes came back to mine, direct, something in them that was different from his usual controlled assessment, something more open briefly before being recovered. He said, "How do you know this?" Not a question about Wei Ziyon, not about palace education or scholarly training, a question about me, about whatever it was in me that he had been noticing, I think, since the very first day, and had been circling with the patience of someone who is very good at not asking the questions they most want answered. I said, "I read widely." He said, "The standard inner palace curriculum does not include nested obligation theory." "No," I agreed, "it doesn't." We looked at each other across the table.
In the lamplight, and it was winter, and the evenings were long, and the lamp on the table between us was the primary source of warmth in the room as much as it was the primary source of light. In that lamplight, I was very aware of the proximate reality of him, of the way he held himself even in the absence of court ceremony, upright without performance, the way people who have been trained to physical discipline carry themselves even in private as a default setting they can no longer turn off. I was aware of his hands. He had, and I mention this purely in the interest of accuracy, remarkable hands, long-fingered, precise in their movements. When he pointed to a section of a scroll to indicate the passage he was discussing, it was with the kind of exactness that never wasted gesture. Those hands on the fourth night reached across the table to turn a scroll toward me, and the edge of his sleeve passed within, I would estimate, 3 centimeters of my wrist. My pulse, against my considered professional judgment, did something unauthorized. I want to be clear about something. I was a litigation attorney in a previous life. I have argued in front of hostile tribunals. I have faced opposing counsel who spent their careers developing specifically targeted professional psychological pressure as a technique. I have been in rooms where the explicit objective of the other party was to make me feel small, destabilized, and outmaneuvered. I had never felt as consistently, comprehensively outmaneuvered as I felt in these consultations. Because here is the thing about Zhao Liongchen that I had not fully accounted for in my initial assessment. He was doing it back.
I had assumed, because I am occasionally arrogant, I will own this, it is a noted professional characteristic, I had assumed that the dynamic of these evenings was me providing intellectual resources and him receiving them, expert to client, advisor to the decision-maker. I had miscalculated. He was learning from me, yes, absorbing the analytical frameworks I offered with a speed and retention that was, frankly, startling, but he was simultaneously teaching. Not obviously, he didn't announce it, but in the questions he chose to ask, in the problems he selected to present, he was constructing something, an argument almost. A case is being built over successive evenings toward a conclusion I couldn't fully see yet. On the 8th night, he said, very casually, as though it were a minor observation rather than the most precisely targeted thing anyone had said to me since I arrived in this body, he said, "The advisors I have are educated in what has been done. You think about what could be done. This is a rare thing." I said, "Most people find it exhausting." He said, "I find it necessary." And then he went back to the scroll in front of him and didn't elaborate, and I sat there with the specific sensation of someone who has just handed a document and is realizing with increasing alarm that they don't know yet whether it's a contract or a trap. The evenings became a kind of rhythm, a rhythm I had not meant to need. I am a methodical person. I structure my time. In my previous life, I had a calendar so precisely organized that my colleagues once joked it was the closest thing to performance art they had witnessed in a professional context. I did not do well with disrupted schedules. I did not do well with uncertainty, with moving variables, with situations where the rule of law was not the primary operating framework. And yet, I began to notice around the 6th day that I was thinking about the evening consultation before it arrived, not strategically, not planning what arguments to present or what topics to raise, but thinking about it the way you think about the one fixed point in an uncertain day, the one coordinate you can navigate from. On the 9th night, there was a snow squall. It arrived fast, even by palace standards, apparently. I could tell because when the night watch changed and the cold deepened, 2 servants I had not previously seen appeared with additional braziers for the room, shooting each other sidewise glances that suggested surprise at their own instructions. Zhao had sent them, I realized, before arriving. He had sent them before arriving. I sat with that fact for a moment, and then I picked up a scroll and pretended I had not sat with it at all. He arrived later than usual, when the snow was genuinely heavy, and his dark outer robe had traces of cold on the shoulders that he removed without comment. He sat, he looked at what I was reading, a revenue distribution proposal I had been annotating with suggested revisions in the margins, and he said, "You changed the notation system. I'd started annotating his scrolls using a simplified symbolic system, shorthand I'd developed in law school for margin notes, and then had realized too late that it was not a notation system that existed in this world. I said, "It's more efficient." He said, and there was something almost warm in it, "Show me." So I showed him, leaning over the scroll together, which required, the table being the size it was, a proximity that was professionally inappropriate by any metric I could cite, my shoulder near his, my hand moving across the parchment while I explained the symbols. He watched my hand. Then he said very quietly, "You are not who I thought you were." I said, without looking up, "Lord Wei is a somewhat limited intellectual biography. I have been working to expand it." "He didn't mean Wei Zian," he said. I looked up.
His face was very close. The lamp between us cast the light in a way that made the angles of his face more pronounced, the dark of his eyes deeper. He was looking at me with an expression that I could not, for the first time in 9 evenings, categorize cleanly. It was not the assessing look. It was not the look of intellectual engagement, which I had catalogued and grown comfortable with. It was something more direct, more personal, more like a closing argument than an opening statement. I said, "Your Majesty." "Zhao," he said, "in this room, you have been speaking to me for 9 evenings about reorganizing the foundational architecture of my administrative state. I believe we can dispense with the formal address." I said, and I will be honest, my voice was slightly less steady than I would professionally prefer. I said, "Zhao, what is it you think I am?" He looked at me for a long moment. "Something unprecedented," he said, "and therefore something I intend to keep." And then he looked back at the scroll and picked up his brush and asked me to continue explaining the notation system. On the 23rd night, he brought a different document. I knew when I saw it that it was different. The parchment was heavier. The seal, when he placed it on the table between us, was not the administrative red of policy documents. It was black, and it was large, and it was the Emperor's personal seal, the one I had only seen in historical records, and which was used, according to those records, for 2 categories of document: imperial edicts of national consequence and personal contracts of the highest binding order. He didn't say anything for a moment. He sat across from me with his hands flat on the table, not reaching for the scroll, not opening it, just sitting with it there between us, like a question he hadn't yet decided how to articulate. I waited. I am good at waiting, in depositions, in mediation, in the long silence before a verdict. I have learned that silence is not empty, that it is in fact full of extremely useful information if you know how to read it. What the silence told me was this: Zhao Liangchen, emperor of this vast and complicated empire, who had, in 23 evenings, demonstrated a capacity for strategic thinking that I would rank, without flattery and without qualification, among the finest I had encountered in any context. Zhao Liangchen was nervous. Not visibly, not in any way that would be perceptible to anyone who had not spent 23 evenings learning the specific microarchitecture of his composure. But his hands, flat on the table, were very slightly more still than usual, the careful stillness of someone managing their own tension rather than the unconscious stillness of someone completely at ease. He said, "I have been thinking about the structure of the Imperial Advisory Court." I said, "I know. We discussed the structural reforms on the 15th evening. The reforms I have been drafting require a specific type of advisor, someone whose analytical framework exists outside the existing institutional orthodoxy, someone who cannot be captured by factional interest because they have no pre-existing factional allegiance." He was speaking carefully, very precisely, the way people speak when they are building towards something and don't want to be misunderstood. That, I said, is a very accurate description of a very unusual personnel requirement. It is, he agreed, and it describes, as I am sure you are aware, exactly one person in this palace. I looked at the scroll. I looked at him. I said, "What does the document say?" He didn't answer immediately.
He looked at me with that expression that I had been unable to categorize on the 9th evening, the one that was more direct than assessment, more personal than intellectual engagement, and it was clearer now, after 2 additional evenings, what it was. It was the expression of someone who has decided. Not hastily, not in a rush of feeling, but in the way that very deliberate, very precise people make decisions when they have gathered sufficient evidence and processed it thoroughly and arrived at a conclusion they are finally prepared to act on. He said, "It is a contract, formal, binding, sealed under my personal authority. It establishes a new position within the imperial advisory structure, senior counsel to the throne. The position carries a rank equivalent to First Minister, independent operational authority within a defined scope and permanent palace residency." He paused. "Not in the Qianxi Pavilion." I breathed. "The contract also includes," he continued, and something in his voice shifted, not much but enough, a degree of warmth that he had been allowing in increments over 23 evenings, each evening a fraction more, as though he had been testing the structural integrity of something. "A secondary clause." "A secondary clause," I said. "A personal clause," he clarified, "not administrative, not subject to court review." I looked at the scroll. I looked at his hands, still flat on the table. I said, "Zhao, I am a person who reads contracts very carefully before signing them." He said, "I know," and there again, unmistakable, the slight shift at the corner of his mouth. Not the ghost of a smile this time, a real one, brief and contained but genuine and directed entirely at me. He said, "I drafted it with that expectation. I expect a thorough review. I expect annotated objections in your notation system. I expect a counter-proposal." "A counter-proposal," I said. "It is," he said, "how negotiations work, as you have frequently pointed out." I reached for the scroll. I unrolled it slowly. The administrative clauses were, as described, precise, comprehensive, and structurally elegant. The scope of the senior counsel position was defined with a clarity that suggested he had thought about it for some time, not drafted in the past few days, but shaped over weeks, probably since around the 6th or 7th evening consultation, refined as he watched me work. I read the administrative clauses twice. They were, objectively, very good. I had minor revisions, 2 points of scope clarification, 1 ambiguous term in the jurisdictional definition, but the bones of it were sound. And then, the secondary clause. I read it once. I read it again. It was written in older formal language than the administrative sections, more archaic, more ceremonial, the language of a tradition older than the current dynasty. But translated through my peculiar transmigration-provided fluency, it said with perfect clarity, "Be it further enacted in the personal authority of the Tianlong throne that the senior counsel to the throne shall hold singular standing in all matters of the imperial household. No competing claim of partnership, alliance, or devotion shall be recognized. The throne acknowledges, in the language of this covenant, a bond of exclusive and mutual regard, formalized in the 43rd year of this reign, irrevocable except by mutual agreement of both signatories." I put the scroll down. I put it down carefully, and I looked at Zhao Liangchen, who was watching me read with the precise, patient attention he gave to everything he considered important. I said, "This clause." He said, "Yes." "The secondary clause." "Yes. This clause is, Zhao, this clause is essentially a partnership covenant," he said. "The oldest form of binding personal agreement in imperial law, predates the current dynasty by 4 centuries. Irrevocable, mutual, equal standing of both parties, which is unprecedented," I said, "for an imperial partnership." "Yes," he said, "it is." Silence. The lamp between us, the snow still falling outside the latticed window, quieter now than it had been 3 evenings ago. The two of us across the table, where we had sat for 23 nights discussing the architecture of empire, and where we were now sitting discussing something else entirely, something that had been being built alongside the administrative work, in the negative space between the arguments, in the proximity over scrolls, and the notation systems, and the particular way he sent servants to heat the room before he arrived so that I wouldn't be cold. I said, "I have questions about this clause." "I expected you would," he said. "The mutual agreement requirement for dissolution is genuine," he said. "I will not hold you by anything other than your own decision. The equal standing provision is genuine," he said again. "I have been considering it for some time. The current advisory structure fails because the advisors have no security. They can be removed, threatened, coerced. If you are to function as a true council, as what you actually are, you require standing that cannot be arbitrarily withdrawn." "That is," I said carefully, "a very strategic rationale for a personal covenant. It is also," he said, and his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, the formality stripped back to something more direct, "it is a true one. Both things can be true simultaneously. You have pointed that out to me several times." I looked at him. He looked at me. I thought about the 43rd year of the Tianlong reign, which I was apparently in, which was apparently the same year I had arrived, which meant I had been here for 23 days, and something had happened in 23 days that I had not, if I was being honest with myself, the most scrupulously honest barrister in my own court. Something had happened that I had noticed and noted and very carefully declined to fully examine. I thought about the moment on the 9th evening when his sleeve had passed my wrist. I thought about the notation system, and the way he had said, "Show me," and the way he had asked about it the following evening, and then had begun using it in his own margin notes with a fluid ease that suggested he'd practiced it in the hours in between. I thought about "You are not who I thought you were," and something unprecedented, and something I intend to keep. I thought about the fact that he had come to the Kenshi Pavilion every single night for 23 nights, in all weathers, without announcement, and that the senior chamberlains were apparently in a state of sustained professional distress about it, and that he had continued to come anyway. I said, "If I sign this contract, Zhao, I want it noted that the secondary clause was not fully disclosed in advance of negotiations." The corner of his mouth, "Duly noted." I also wanted noted that the 30-day window under the supplementary provisions has elapsed, which means the banishment decree is technically still on the record, and the signing of a new imperial contract under a new designation without formally revoking the prior decree creates an administrative ambiguity that... "The banishment decree," he said, "was revoked on the 4th day. I had it pulled from the record after our first conversation." I stopped. "You didn't tell me," I said. "No," he agreed. "Why?" He looked at me with an expression that, in 23 evenings, I had been cataloguing without being fully willing to name. And now, with the contract unrolled between us, and the lamp burning low, and the snow settling quietly outside, I named it. "Because," he said, "I wanted to know if you would stay without it." Oh. He had revoked my reason for strategic engagement on day 4. He had continued to come every night for 19 additional evenings. He had been watching, waiting, constructing his own case in the same parallel manner I had been constructing mine, not about administrative reform, but about this, about the precise incremental establishment of something neither of us had a clean legal term for. I picked up the scroll. I looked at the secondary clause again. I thought, Shen Mu, Senior Associate, Liang Fang and Associates, Bar Exam First Attempt, Commercial Disputes Tribunal at 28. You have never in your professional life lost a case you prepared properly for. You are going to sign this contract, and you are going to tell yourself it is because the administrative clauses are sound, and the scope of the senior counsel position is genuinely well designed, and this is a strategic decision made on rational grounds after thorough review. And some of it will be true, and some of it the part you have been very carefully not examining, which is nevertheless present in every single one of the 23 evenings, and in the notation system, and in the way you have been thinking about what to say before he arrives. Some of it will be something else entirely. I reached for the brush. He was still watching me, completely still, the forced stillness I had identified as the management of tension, except it was more visible now than it had ever been, the control more deliberate, and something moved behind his eyes, waiting, the specific quality of someone who is very practiced at waiting and who is finding this particular wait more difficult than most. I dipped the brush. I held it over the parchment. I said, "I have 2 conditions before I sign." "Name them," he said immediately. "The notation system becomes officially recognized in imperial administrative documents." A pause, then "done." "And the northern satrap's revenue adjustment is implemented before the next taxation cycle, with a formal correction issued by the Court of Revenue." A longer pause, then "done." The warmth in his voice was unhidden now, barely managed, something I had been watching approach for 23 evenings and which had finally arrived. "Done. Shen Mu." I stopped breathing. He had called me not Wei Ziyan, not Lord Wei, not the formal address, not the title. Shen Mu. He knew, or he had arrived by the extraordinary precision of a mind that had been paying extremely close attention to something close enough to knowing that the distinction was immaterial. I looked up at him. His eyes in the lamplight were very dark and very open in a way I had not seen before. The controlled assessment gone, the careful management gone, something more direct and more honest and more terrifying than anything he had shown me in 23 evenings of the most demanding intellectual engagement of my life. He said, "I don't know how you came here. I don't know who you were before, but I know what you are now, in this room, in this palace." I said, in a voice that was not as steady as I would like, "A senior counsel to the throne." "Yes," he said, "among other things." I put the brush to the parchment. I signed. Here is what I know about the case of Shen Mu versus the space-time continuum, which I have been litigating in one form or another since I woke up in a silk-draped pavilion with no standing desk and no coffee machine, and a banishment decree that turned out to be the best legal document I had ever received. I have won. The northern satraps will receive their corrected revenue allocation. The administrative reform bill, drafted over 17 evenings of joint consultation and now residing in a sealed case in the Imperial Archive awaiting implementation, will restructure the advisory court in ways that will take this dynasty's efficiency from functional to extraordinary. The banishment decree has been revoked. The Qianxi Pavilion is no longer my residence. I have won the case. The case I have lost, the case I didn't know I was in, that had been running as a parallel proceeding since approximately the 4th evening, when a man with extraordinary hands and a voice like a precision instrument asked me to continue, and I did, without adequately examining why. The case I have lost is a different one entirely. I put down the brush. I looked at the contract, the seal, both our marks, irrevocable, mutual, equal standing of both parties. I looked at Zhao Liangchen, who was looking at the signed contract with an expression that I had no legal framework for and no professional precedent for, and which was nevertheless the most clearly readable thing I had seen in all my time in this palace. He looked up. Our eyes met. I said, I want it on the record that I entered this agreement with full disclosure and clear intent. It is on the record, he said. His voice was very quiet. The document is sealed. Good, I said. Then I also want it on the record that the strategy you employed, 23 consecutive evenings, progressive establishment of trust, deliberate withholding of the revocation until you had determined independent motivation, was extremely well executed. The smile now was complete, not contained, not the ghost or the fraction. His smile, which I was realizing I had been constructing an expectation of for weeks without being fully aware of it. He said, I had a very good teacher. My name is Shen Mu. I was a litigation attorney. I had a 12-step skincare routine and a standing desk and a coffee machine that cost more than most people's rent. I woke up in a 9th century imperial palace in a body that was not mine, holding a banishment decree with no resources except a legal mind and 23 days. The case has concluded. The next case, however, the one sitting across from me right now, watching me with eyes that are dark and open and terrifyingly well informed, I think that one is going to run considerably longer. The end.